When you look at all of the bridges today, it is the Main Street Bridge, the John T. Alsop, that is our oldest road bridge. And I do think it is the one that's the most revered, the most beloved. After all, it was selected as the centerpiece recently when we showcased our city to the world with the Super Bowl. And more recently, when we decided to light some of our bridges in this city, I think that said a lot about how our residents feel about our bridges. They're such an important part of the city's landscape.
World War II veterans returning home to Jacksonville took advantage of the GI Bill, which provided them with educational and home ownership opportunities. Families looked to the suburbs to purchase new homes, and by 1960, the population of Duval County, outside of Jacksonville, doubled.
Government policies and an American desire for space and perhaps for larger families after World War II led to a movement across the country out of the cities into the suburbs.
Now they wanted to have their own place, and they could buy in Arlington or Lakewood or in Cedar Hills on the west side. And there was this tremendous motivation for having one's own home.
And people moved out of the cities because it was more affordable, and transportation advances made it easy to move out. So instead of living in a downtown area, as you might have earlier in Jacksonville, you could move out to Arlington, or you could move to San Marco or further out and buy a home for an affordable amount and have some space. And it was a part of the American dream.
So there was a tremendous demand for housing at all economic levels in Duval County after World War II due to these various and sundry things going on. And so we had essentially suburban sprawl seen in one perspective, but in another perspective is a chance for individuals to have their own home, the great American dream.
It led to the weakening of the city because those who were least able to move out were the minorities in Jacksonville, African Americans, because they didn't have the money to move out, and also housing policies were pretty segregated, even in the early 50s, so that you left the city poorer and blacker as white suburban families moved out of the city.
Initially, African Americans could not follow simply because there were laws that restricted African Americans to certain areas of town when it came to residential areas. And later on, when those kind of statutes were overturned, you had economic factors, political factors, and social factors. We've all heard of white flight. What we started to see, for example, in the 1960s with desegregation is a number of whites relocated out of areas like the Springfield area. Those are the kind of factors that really contribute to the growth of the suburbs as well as the bridges, because now after the bridges, like the Fuller Warren Bridge, you can build suburbs at a greater distance from the major, from the original areas of town.
Families, people moved out of town, and instead of moving necessarily west, many of them moved south and east, so they had to cross the river. And as the suburbs grew and increased in size, so that they were much larger than old Jacksonville, you can begin to get more and more traffic coming over the bridges, and that traffic leads to congestion, leads to the need for new bridges or more bridges.
While residents and families moved out of downtown and into the suburbs, downtown remained the center of business and commerce in Jacksonville. Breadwinners commuted daily to downtown, and traffic congestion increased. A contributing factor to the increased congestion was regional traffic heading through Jacksonville and into South Florida. City leaders recognized the need for a bypass around downtown to help ease congestion.
Up until the 1940s, basically, you had the Main Street Bridge and you had the Acosta Bridge, and these were really close, and they were very much, of course, designed to accommodate the traffic that's going to and from downtown area, but it was becoming very obvious that that was not sufficient.
City leaders at the chamber and elsewhere realized during the war that this had been a mistake and that they really wanted to have some kind of a beltway, they didn't use those terms, but roads around downtown Jacksonville to take particularly regional traffic away from the city.
In the 1940s, they began to look at the city and understanding that they really had to create a major transportation network, and that is when they decided that they needed additional bridges.
And the question was, well, how do you go around downtown? And one way would be a bridge to the south of the city, and one way would be a bridge to the east or north of the city.
And immediately what they recognized is that they needed at least 2 additional bridges.
The first thought was what became the Fuller-Warren Bridge. Behind the building, the decisions to build the Fuller-Warren and also the Matthews Bridge was the rapid suburban growth on the south side, particularly Arlington, but also beginning in the area like Lakewood. And both bridges were to use as a bypass for downtown to keep the traffic congestion, to reduce the traffic congestion downtown.
In 1951, the decision was made to build a bridge that would connect the Riverside area with the Southside area. Originally, it was called the Gilmore Street Bridge. It also became part of the interstate highway system because at that point they were still developing the highway system, especially the north-south route. Ultimately, what would become I-95 was, the concept was in the works. And so the Fuller-Warren Bridge became part of that.
The original plan for the interstate highways called for routes to go right up to the edges of cities and then bypass them. Most cities immediately saw the interstate highway, though, as a way to relieve downtown traffic congestion and rescue a downtown urban core. Downtown retailers saw the arrival of the interstate as a godsend, as a rescue for them. They thought, this is wonderful. We're going to be able to get our customers downtown far easier than we ever used to. The irony, of course, is that those interstates made it easy for people to get downtown and easy for them to get out of downtown, too.
The Fuller-Warren Bridge had a great impact on Jacksonville's African American community. Not so much the bridge itself, but the approach to the bridge, 95 South. When it was constructed, it cut right through the heart of a very thriving African American community on the west side. And it was not a community that, or not a neighborhood that had real estate that was not producing, that was not productive, that was not well taken care of. These were very substantial homes for the most part that were condemned by the right of eminent domain and destroyed for the building of 95, which then leads to the Fuller-Warren Bridge.
By the time the bridge was completed, they decided, I think in 1953 or 54, that they would name it the Fuller-Warren Bridge. And Warren was still alive, but he'd done so much to help to facilitate the growth of the transportation network in Jacksonville, as well as the state, that they decided to name it after Fuller-Warren Bridge. But it was really to really facilitate transportation between the Southside area and Riverside.
The Fuller-Warren Bridge's the greatest impact was probably more on the development of the state of Florida than on the local area. The interstate traffic, and it was clearly seen to be part of an interstate highway system from its original planning. The interstate component was more important in terms of developing the southern part of Florida.
With 3 vehicular bridges connecting Jacksonville to areas south of the river, the need was recognized to connect Jacksonville to areas east of the river, including the beaches. Residents of Arlington lobbied for a bridge that would allow them quicker access to downtown.
Well, Arlington, prior to the Matthews Bridge, was a little collection of a couple of little villages. Arlington was one of them, a few stores, a couple thousand people, semi-rural.
It was hard to get to downtown Jacksonville. You had to drive through South Jacksonville. Arlington had no doctors. We had very few commercial, no grocery store, no laundromats. There were a lot of landowners that had owned land for a long time.